Being none, the yeas are 64, the nays are 35. The Merkley Amendment number 1884 is agreed to. Under the previous order, the motion is reconsidered, is considered made and laid upon the table. The clerk will read the title of the bill for a third time.
Counter number 334, H.R. 3606, an act to increase American job creation economic growth by improving access to the public capitals markets for emerging growth companies.
Ooh. May we have order, please? Senators, may we have order, please? Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote on passage of H.R. 3606 as amended. The senator from Rhode Island. And may we have, please take your conversations out. The senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, the House legislation has some very promising concepts, providing access to capital.
The Senate is not in order. Senators, please take your conversations out of the Senate, the floor of the Senate. The senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam President. The House bill has some promising concepts, but what it fails to do is adequately protect investors. We have tried through our alternative to protect investors. That alternative has been rejected on a cloture vote by the Senate. We have made some improvements with the Merkley proposal, but we're not quite to the point yet where I think we can be confident that investors will be protected. And as such, I think we should vote against this legislation, that we should in fact try again and get it right. That is why the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission opposes it. The former head of the Securities and Exchange Commission opposes it. The former chief accountant for the Securities and Exchange Commission. The institutional investors oppose it. We are opening up vast loopholes without disclosure, adequate disclosure to investors. I think we will regret this vote.
Madam President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Madam President, if I could claim the time in support of this legislation. I would just suggest, Madam President, that we're on the verge of doing something very, very constructive for our economy, for small businesses, and for job growth. And it might be one of the most constructive things we're going to do this year in that area. This legislation makes it easier and more affordable for young and growing companies to go public, to raise the capital they need to grow, to hire more workers. It also actually makes it easier for those that want to remain private to attract more investors and to do so without triggering the very onerous and expensive regulations that attend to being a public company. This is going to create more jobs, more growth in the economy. That's why it passed the House with a vote of 390 to 23. That's why the President of the United States has endorsed this bill and said he will sign it into law. That's why there are dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations and groups and companies and trade associations who support this legislation, so that we can do something right here, right now, today, that the President will sign into law, which will help small and growing companies raise the capital they need to grow, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes.
The question is on the passage of the bill as amended. Yeas? The yeas and nays have been asked for. Is there sufficient a second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will ask for the yeas and nays. We'll call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. DeMint, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Frank, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell. So yes. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray. No. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Barrasso, Bennett, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Corker, Crapo, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Inouye, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Cole, Kyle, Lugar, McCaskill, Moran, Paul, Portman, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Rubio, Schumer, Sessions, Stabenow, Tester, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Vitter, Warner, Wicker, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Baucus, Begich, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Conrad, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harkin, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, and Sanders. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Webb, no. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. DeMint, aye. Mr. Franken, no. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Bingaman, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. McCain, Mr. McCain, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse? No. Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Akaka? Mr. Akaka? No. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson of Nebraska? Aye. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of New Mexico? No. Mr. Lieberman? Mr. Lieberman? Aye. Mr. Carey, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye.
Is there anyone in the chamber who hasn't voted who wishes to change their vote? On this roll call, H.R. 3606 as amended, 73 ayes and 26 noes. The provision is passed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. And under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to agree to the House amendment to Senate Bill 2038, which the clerk will report.
Motion to concur in the House amendment to S. 2038, an act to prohibit members of Congress and employees of Congress from using non-public information derived from their official positions for personal benefit and for other purposes.
There'll be order in the Senate. You take your conversations out of the well. Under the previous order, there will be 4 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, I thank the Chair. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bipartisan, now bicameral congressional ethics measure. This started out as a response to stories and allegations that members of Congress would not be held liable for insider trading. It then developed into what I think is the most significant congressional ethics legislation that we've adopted in at least 5 years, containing a lot of other public disclosure, good government measures. So I want to give particular thanks to Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and Scott Brown, who led the effort, took the initiative that got this good ball rolling, and I would yield the rest of my time to Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Chairman Lieberman. We are certainly taking a significant step forward today on behalf of the American people to restoring some faith that our country has in their government. I want to thank Leader Reid for his leadership, Chairman Lieberman, Ranking Member Collins, Senator Brown, and all of our colleagues here on both sides of the aisle who worked so hard to pass this legislation. I also want to thank my colleague from New York, Congresswoman Louise Slaughter, who fought so hard and so long towards this effort. This legislation was a rare instance where 96 senators came together to deliver results for the American people. We passed a strong bill with teeth that will clearly and expressly make it illegal for members of Congress, their staff, and their families to gain personal profits from non-public information gained through their service. I strongly believe that we have to make it clear that no one is above the law and that members of Congress need to play by the exact same rules as every other American. It's simply the right thing to do. This is a common-sense bill, and Americans can be assured that our only interest is in their interest. When President Obama signs the Stock Act, we will have begun to restore some of the public's faith in Washington.
Senator's time has expired.
Madam President.
The senator from Maine.
Thank you, Madam President. I would ask to be notified after 1 minute.
Senator will be notified.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, let me begin by commending Senator Scott Brown, Senator Lieberman and Senator Gillibrand for their leadership on this bill. I want to point out that my colleague from Massachusetts introduced the first bill on this topic in the Senate. The Stock Act is intended to affirm that members of Congress are not exempt from our laws and regulations prohibiting insider trading. It is important to send a very clear message that members of Congress are not exempt from these laws, and that is exactly what this bill does. At a time when public confidence in Congress is at an all-time low, we need to send a strong message that elective...
Has consumed 1 minute.
That elective office is a place for public service and not private gain. I yield the remainder of my time to Senator Scott Brown.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Madam President, thank you. Today we put America first, and we passed a bipartisan, now bicameral bill that the President will sign, and we took a step toward ending the deficit of trust that's hurting our democracy. I do want to thank Senator Gillibrand and obviously the leadership of Senator Collins and Lieberman for actually marking this up so quickly. And today is a good day.
The Senate will be in order.
Madam President, thank you. The Stock Act will affirm that members of Congress are not above the law. It will increase transparency by requiring members of Congress and highly compensated federal employees to disclose all their trading activity within 45 days. Today, America is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and that means our elected officials must follow the same laws as everybody else. We have taken a step towards reestablishing trust, and today we are one step closer to making every seat the people's seat. Thank you, and I encourage everybody to support this passage. And I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the Reid motion to concur in the House Amendment to 2038, the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act, signed by 22 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to concur in the House Amendment to Senate Bill 2038, an act to prohibit members of Congress and employees of Congress from using non-public information derived from their official positions for personal benefit and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal.
How do you vote for Brown? I'd like to vote for Brown.
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Alexander, Barrasso, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Carper, Chambliss, Coates, Cochran, Conrad, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heller, Hoven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Inouye, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Klobuchar, Cole, Kyle, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Lieberman, Manchin, McCain, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Paul, Portman, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Roberts, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schumer, Sessions, Shaheen, Snow, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Burr, Coburn, Grassley. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Begich, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Udall, Colorado, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. Aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus. Aye.
They don't. On this vote, the yeas are 96, the nays are 3. 3/5 of the senators having duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to. Cloture having been invoked, the motion to refer falls as inconsistent with cloture. Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is yielded back. The motion to concur in the House amendment with amendment number 1940 is withdrawn, and the motion to concur in the House amendment is agreed to. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. Under the previous order, the senator will proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Nominations, the judiciary. David Nuffer of Utah to be United States District Judge for the District of Utah. Ronnie Abrams of New York.
We have order, Madam President.
Order in the Senate.
Ronnie Abrams of New York to be United States District Judge for the Southern District of New York. Rudolph Contreras of Virginia to be United States District Judge for the District of Columbia.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided in the usual form. Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I ask consent, and I would note this as in morning business, that the bipartisan Violence Against Women Act reauthorization now has 61 co-sponsors, and I thank Senator Crapo for his leadership and the senators on both parties who came to the floor last week.
Senate will be in order. Senator from Vermont.
I thank those senators, both Republicans and Democratic senators, who came to the floor last week to speak about the importance of reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. I ask my full statement be placed in the record.
Without objection.
I ask consent to include in the record, in connection with the Stock Act, my statement expressing disappointment the Senate took the House version and stripped out our bipartisan anti-corruption amendment without a vote.
Without objection.
And, Madam President, I ask consent to put in statements regarding the judicial nominees that are here.
Without objection.
And, Madam President, I would note on this side at least, I know we have to have a roll call on this first nominee. I have no objection if there's voice votes on the next two. But that will be up to others. But on the first one, I ask for the yeas and nays on the first.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will call. Who yields time? All time yielded back. The yeas and nays have been ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Sanders. Do you want to go? Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Sure. Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Inze, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill,
Aye.
Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative, Akaka, Alexander, Ayat, Barrasso, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Burr, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Coons, Cornyn, Crapo, Inze, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Hoven, Inouye, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Carey, Cole, Kyle, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Paul, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Risch, Roberts, Rockefeller, Sanders, Sessions, Snow, Stabenow, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Bitter, Webb, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Dement voted in the negative. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mrs. Hutchison, Aye. Mr. McCain. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Aye.